Coke Studio wasn't just a music show, it was an emotion. Coke Studio for almost half a decade was the ambassador for Pakistani arts and culture scene. Coke Studio wasn't just about songs, it was a whole experience. The rawness, the cultural representation. But you know, somewhere along the way, it seemed like the magic was fading. You know, the rawness, the cultural richness. It seemed like Coke Studio was going in a direction which was less about music and more about something else. You know, how did Coke Studio, which was once the gold standard for Pakistani music, lose its way? So let's break it down in this video. So, you know, to understand where Coke Studio went wrong, we have to revisit where it all began. So, years ago in 2008, a Pakistani musician called Hyatt set the grounds for Coke Studio. He envisioned a platform where live music, experimentation, and cultural representation can all thrive in one fusion. The focus entirely in the initial years of Coke Studio was on minimalistic productions and organic instruments. So, you know, in my opinion, Coke Studio Season 1 and 2, which was under Rohail production, I think I would always call it the most golden era of Coke Studio, because the kind of music and the kind of compositions that we saw that year was just unbelievable. Songs like Ek Alaf, Sai Raat Jaga by Noori was on the same season, Nindiya Re by Kavish was on the same season, and the iconic composition of classical music and rock meeting together in Garaj Baras. You know, Rahat almost had Coke Studio for 6 seasons, from season 1 to season 6. And I think the most classic songs, the most iconic Coke Studio sound has come in those years. Coke Studio sounded very royal. It was very authentic. It was a very unique Coke Studio sound. You could not replicate it somewhere else. Uske baad Coke Studio India bhi aaya, Coke Studio Nepal, Coke Studio bahut zyada qisam ke hain. But the kind of sound that Coke Studio in the early years it had, it was very royal. It was too big. I truly believe that Coke Studio की जो sound थी in the early years, वही sound को replicate करने की या उसको mimic करने की कोशिश की गई in the years later. So this Coke Studio, which I call the golden era, I think the music was at its purest. There were no gimmicks, no overproduction. Music was the priority, and there was only brilliance placed on music production. So season 6 Coke Studio ke baad, it kind of went into a rotation period where Coke Studio was handed over to a different producer almost every year or 2 years later. That really changed Coke Studio's sound. That really changed what Coke Studio stood for. From season 7, 8 and 9, very infamous Pakistani band Strings took over for production. And I think from season 6 to season 10, Coke Studio entirely worked because they didn't do much around with the format. You know, Strings somehow maintained the legacy Rohail had set for Coke Studio. The sound was very similar, the musicians were very similar, even the house band was almost the same. And you know, in my opinion, season 10, which was under Strings, is probably the best Coke Studio season that has ever been produced. That's just my opinion. But if I have to defend myself, in season 10, there's music like Tinak Din Na. There's songs like Fasle by Kavish. There's Naina More, which I think is the best composition Coke Studio has ever done. But after season 10, in season 11, Coke Studio was handed over to Zuhaib Qazi and Ali Hamza, and they kind of went in a different direction. It was not entirely different than what Coke Studio was, but they were doing more, experimentation with like a modern and a more contemporary sound. And if you were anybody around the time like season 11 and 12 was coming out of Coke Studio, तब बहुत ज़्यादा criticism मिलता था to the platform कि यार रेल आपको वापस लेके आए, ये strings को क्यों दिया हुआ है, ज़ुहैब काजी कौन है, ये क्या हो रहा है. And season 12 में Coke Studio was handed over back to Mr. Rahat Khan, and there were mixed feelings. You could not particularly achieve the sound that was set in the early years. Production equipment इतना change हो चुका था. Musicians started to perform very differently. तो वो जो एक original sound था, जो रेल हाथ ने खुद ही define किया था for Coke Studio, it could not be found in season 12. बस अब दिल खिड़की को खोलो. In season 13, it was just a random season. I think it was mostly shot inside Rohail house. And season 14. So this era I would call the visual over music era. So in season 14, Xulfi took over Coke Studio, and it was already well defined by him that Coke Studio is not anymore going to be about just music. It's going to be a visual and audio experience, and a lot of emphasis was put on the production of video. For me personally, that was when like Coke Studio lost its essence. That is where it saw a major shift, and like it definitely could not go back to what Coke Studio ever was. In the early years of Coke Studio, there were a lot of compositions, a lot of combinations that were not working. I remember ek zamane mein there was a song called Julie, Ali Zafar and Dalia Zafar. It was a terrible song. Then there was this tribute done by Atif Aslam to Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson had died around the time Coke Studio had come out. So they did a little tribute to Michael Jackson, and it was just terrible. But when Xulfi took over, they relied heavily on contemporary music and like visuals and like flashy spectacle happening. Music was not a big part of like Coke Studio anymore. And a lot of people can argue about season 14 and 15 ke like ab video ka zamana hai, a lot of people love music videos or ye sab kuch hona chahiye. I agree. But Coke Studio was a lot about music and culture also. This whole visual and flashy like attempt to go on trends and working on trends and like going global, I think it took away what Coke Studio was about, and that was our cultural representation. You can say that there were music jo Balochi the, there was music jo Sindh ka bhi tha aur Pashto bhi tha aur ye sab kuch tha, but there was still stuff happening which we have no clue about. It would make sense that Coke Studio is doing like a global version of their music playlist, और उसमें तुक बनती है कि यार नॉर्वे से musicians लिए हुए हैं और दुनिया के किसी भी हिस्से से आपने musicians लिए हुए हैं और आप collaborate कर रहे हैं. But like doing it on Coke Studio Pakistan, it didn't sit well with me. There was a time when Coke Studio was a lot about like live jam sessions. Musicians are feeding off each other's energy, and you could see that in the video. You could see that in the early years कि वो एक दूसरे को देख रहे हैं. एक certain सुर लगी है, एक certain drum could follow the guitar could follow the drums. तो वो एक दूसरे का एक connection दिखता था visually. So that is not the case anymore. It's a lot about like literally there was a video जिसमें CGI हुआ है. And I think the biggest problem with this whole video direction of Coke Studio was that nothing felt live. There's a part of like this song called Kanna Yari जहाँ पे the musician's mic is so far away from his mouth, and then it comes closer and the sound is the same. वो आहिस्ता होनी चाहिए उसकी आवाज या ऊंची हो जानी चाहिए जब माइक करीब आए दूर आए, but the sound is completely flat. Everything is too polished, it's too perfect because you could do multiple takes. It does not matter like आपने कौन सी audio take लिया, कौन सी video take ली है. You can take the best audio take and you can take the best video take and put them together, and you have a Coke Studio song. I don't know why this is like the toughest solution Coke Studio cannot come up with, that there has to be one producer, there has to be one house band, there has to be one organization that can entirely understand the essence of Coke Studio and what it stood for Pakistani people growing up with Coke Studio, and could maintain that sovereignty, could maintain the identity Coke Studio had. With these changing producers every 2 years, every 3 years, they try to bring in their own flavor, as they should and as they would. But that took away from what the platform stood for. Oh, yeah, global trend pe number 1 aaya, number 2 aaya, number 3 aaya. That doesn't do much as much as like creating iconic sounds that can live forever. Songs like Kanyari Dhol Geet, songs like Chori Chori, songs like Ek Alif, Jalpari. In my opinion, Coke Studio was never about perfection. It was just about passion for music. Coke Studio didn't just give us songs, it gave us identity, It showed the world our rich musical heritage. But somewhere in the race to stay relevant, I think we lost the essence of Coke Studio and whatever Rohail Hyatt envisioned back in 2008. So, maybe it's not too late to go back to what Coke Studio stood for, or maybe like the sound that Coke Studio originally had, maybe it's just lost forever. So do tell me what you think. Is Coke Studio losing its magic, or is it just evolving?